Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started momentarily. I love seeing the attendee numbers bump up. If you'd like, feel free to share in the chat where you're calling from. We'd love to see where we're connecting with folks from. Thank you for joining us today. Oh, Alexa's on the call. Hi, Alexa. We're looking at all our friends who are on the call. This is great. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone to NMWA xChange, Lavinia Fontana, Trailblazer, Rule Breaker. Today is Tuesday, May 9th, and we are really excited to welcome you and welcome our guest today. NMWA xChange is a spinoff of the award-winning pandemic live stream series, BMA NMWA, which we produced with our friends at the Baltimore Museum of Art. I'm Addie Gayoso, NMWA's senior educator. Welcome, viewers, and thank you for joining us today. Today's episode of NMWA xChange is Cart Caption, thanks to Joyful Signing and our live captioner, Teddy Jackson, for making this possible. To see the live caption, simply click on the CC button in Zoom. Also, feel free to add your questions in the chat or in the Q&A sections, and we will do our best to address those today during our time with our guest. For those of you who are unfamiliar with NMWA xChange, each month, NMWA's hosts are joined by special guests to center women creatives. We consider topics relevant to our world and offer insight into collaborations NMWA is fostering while its building is closed for renovation. During this time of change, we are excited to exchange ideas with our guests and viewers. On our last episode, Deborah Gaston, Director of Education and Interpretation, and I spoke with to curator Alexa Grice from the Art Gallery of Ontario. Hi, Alexa. Thanks for joining us. And Baltimore Museum of Art's Tess Kutaz Christensen about their exhibition, Making Her Mark, A History of Women Artists in Europe, 1400 to 1800, which opens in Baltimore in October of 2023 and then travels to Ontario in the beginning of 2024. As always, you can check out past NMWA xChange episodes and subscribe to catch future episodes on YouTube. I'll share that link in just a second. My co-host today is my regular co-host, senior curator at NMWA, Jenny Trainer. Hey, Jenny, thanks for being with us.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to be back. I was away last month, but I'm really excited to be here today to continue our conversation about historical women artists, of which I certainly can't get enough. And we are going to speak today about another exciting exhibition that just opened this past weekend at the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin on one of our favorite collection artists, Lavinia Fontana. And to do that, we are joined by the curator of this ambitious project, Aoife Brady. Aoife, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Really delighted to engage in this wonderful program.
I'm really excited for this talk today. I love Lavinia Fontana, and I certainly don't need to tell you that a monographic exhibition on this important artist is really long overdue. And so I'm wondering if you can give us kind of a brief history of any previous exhibitions that have included Fontana and how the idea for this one kind of came about.
Of course. The first exhibition devoted to Lavinia Fontana took place in the Museo Civico Archeologico in Bologna in 1994, so almost 30 years ago. And then, of course, a slightly smaller iteration of this exhibition came to you guys in Washington, D.C. in 1998. And those were the only monographic exhibitions to date on this extraordinary Renaissance artist before we launched this here in Dublin. I mean, we had a somewhat natural reason to focus on Fontana here in Dublin, in that we have her monumental composition depicting the Queen of Sheba visiting King Solomon. And this is a painting that's been in our collection here in Ireland since the 1870s. So something that we've had here for a long, long time now. But of course, it comes at a time when women artists are really a hot topic for museums. And we've seen Fontana, we encounter her work in many exhibitions of recent years gone by, not least that in the Museo del Prado in 2019, where they mounted an exhibition devoted to the work of the great Spanish court artist Sofonisba Anguissola in tandem with Lavinia Fontana. And then she's featured in many different wonderful survey shows of work of early modern women artists, including one closer to home for you guys, the Detroit Hartford exhibition By Her Hand, which included some of the artist's portraits. But this is, as I said, the first sort of deep dive, the first monographic exhibition to focus on Lavinia in well over 2 decades. And it comes at a time when we have completed a major conservation project on the visit of the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon. This was a conservation project that we undertook here in Dublin between 2019 and 2021, over almost 18 months of solid work, of solid conservation and research. And that gave me a good grounding from which to launch this monographic show.
I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit so people can see this wonderful painting that you're mentioning. It's really extraordinary and it's enormous, right?
It is.
Yeah.
All of the figures that you see here, this retinue of ladies and the Queen herself, are more or less life size. So you approach this really and you can almost enter the scene. It's quite a spectacular thing. And what's extraordinary about it is that every inch of the canvas, despite its enormous scale, is rendered with this exceptional attention to detail that we've come to associate with Lavinia and her portraits.
So you certainly have, this kind of jewel in your collection, and that provided a really good impetus for taking a closer look at this artist and bringing a lot of her works together in this exhibition. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, monographic exhibitions like this and kind of why they're important and what you can really get out of an exhibition like this.
Of course. I mean, doing this kind of deep dive in an artist allows us to really explore their style and the characteristics of their paintings and of their work and their practice in depth that you can't really do when you feature them as a sort of a single work in a broader survey show. One of the great things that we've been able to focus on here that I know that you guys are particularly interested in your own institution is Lavinia's technique and her workshop practice. And we find that often with women artists in particular, that this is an aspect that's not very well studied, that often preoccupation with women's biographies overtakes any kind of serious consideration of their practice, of their technique. And so this is one aspect that we've been able to really explore in some depth in the exhibition in Dublin, how Lavinia worked, and sort of reorientate, I suppose, our view of the artist as this anomalous woman working at the end of the 1600s, the 1500s, into a sort of a master in her own right.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, because the technical analysis that a project like this affords the opportunity for is really important, because we know that, examining works of art can be costly and it's time consuming. I think people might have this idea that, every work of art in a collection has been thoroughly analyzed, and that's not the case. I mean, choices have to be made about what you're going to work on and why, and very often, at least historically speaking, women artists have not been prioritized in the same way. And so, yeah, I think we do have a lot less of an understanding of the working method and, to your point, the workshop practices of a lot of early modern women artists. So are there any interesting tidbits you want to share about Fontana's working method? Or
there have been many. This picture alone, I mean, gave us an awful lot of insights into Fontana's practice, because it covers such a wide variety of genres. It addresses so many of the different things that she paints. We have portraiture, we have landscape, we have still life elements, and then these sumptuous textiles. And we did this really intensive conservation and research project that took place over 18 months. And it was during pandemic days when we had time to really dig into this and focus on it exclusively and think about Fontana and how she might have been working. And we made some interesting discoveries, like the kind of yellow that she uses to paint what looks like gold thread or gold leaf. She uses a very specific pigment called lead tin yellow type 2, and it has these wonderful sort of iridescent three-dimensional qualities that give the impression of gold when one stands at a distance, when it's used in a very specific kind of way. And this tells us that the artist knew exactly what she was doing, that she was selecting very specific pigments to give very specific visual effects. So she wasn't somebody who was grappling around in the dark trying to get to grips with this male profession. She was a person that really knew what she was up to. She knew what she was at. We also found some really interesting things about the gestation period of her pictures, if you like, the length of time it took to create a composition like this. And we know from technical analysis that she worked on this painting, which is widely recognized as her most ambitious composition, her most detailed in any case. We know that she worked on this over a period of years. And this again speaks to the practice of a woman artist in this period. She would have been working largely in isolation. She wasn't permitted to have a team of studio assistants shoulder to shoulder in her studio. And as such, things took a little bit longer to finish.
Andy, did you want to ask a question, or can I?
Yeah, well, actually, I think that speaking of all this sort of technical, like better understanding Fontana's practice, we have some really cool images of, I believe, some sketching that she did in advance of some work, just to give folks a sense, and maybe we can speak a little bit to that. What are we
Absolutely.
looking at here? Yeah.
Here we're looking at two recently discovered artworks by Lavinia Fontana, recently attributed to Lavinia Fontana and recently purchased by the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Now, despite the fact that they're brand new acquisitions for the Getty, they very generously have sent them to Dublin. And I'm really pleased that they did, because they give us an absolutely unique insight into how Fontana worked, into her creative process. So here we have on the right-hand side, a large-scale compositional study. And this is in pen and ink. And it's exactly the same size as the copper panel that you see on the left. So this is a study, a drawing that was created in preparation for the painting, the painted copper panel that you see here. And it shows the careful and methodical planning that went into the realization of some of Fontana's smaller scale works. So while she may not have used this method across the board in the creation of every composition, we now see that when she was addressing small scale and detailed works like this, she may have used these full-size studies. And when you see this object in the flesh, it's really wonderful to see in person. And for those of you who can and want to travel to Dublin, I encourage you to come and see it in real life, because you can actually see the transfer process on the surface of this paper. So she's used a blunt instrument, a blunt pointed instrument, to sort of very heavily lean on the outline of her drawing. She's sat it on top of her copper panel, and she's sort of created indents in the paper that were transferred then onto the panel, and transferred the entirety of her drawing onto the copper panel before she begins painting. And then we see some deviations from the drawn composition and the painted one to show that during this process there was some creativity used. She's not just repeating what we see on the paper exactly on her copper panel, but rather she's adapting things as she works, and she's editing the image as she paints.
That's really interesting. The works that we have in our collection are works on canvas. So how is her process different, since this is clearly on metal and she was able to sort of make some of that transfer? How is it different in terms of sort of studies she may have made for paintings she created on canvas?
It's a really interesting question. While copper panel might seem like a strange material to us, it was actually very common in Bologna by the beginning of the 17th century. And in fact, it was brought to Bologna by a Flemish painter called Denis Keilvert, who was a collaborator with Prospero Fontana, Lavinia's father. And so Lavinia Fontana becomes a really early exponent of this very specific kind of technique. She becomes very accomplished at it early in her career, and she becomes one of the earliest artists on the Italian peninsula to practice the technique of painting on copper. In terms of how it would differ, well, most of the time copper panels are on a much smaller scale than canvas, because of course canvas is light and flexible and lends itself to large scale compositions. So frequently we see these copper panels, they're used for small scale devotional pictures, sometimes portraits, and often things that were given as gifts. In terms of how the technique of painting on copper differed, well, a lot of the time it was really the preparation layer that differed. So it was important to put down a good preparation layer that ensured good adhesion of paint to metal. But otherwise, the process was more or less the same. She's still using oil-bound pigment, so it's an oil paint. And the copper imparts this wonderful luminosity, this kind of reflective quality that makes these little pictures really jewel-like and absolutely perfect for gifts.
It's really beautiful. Yeah, go ahead, Jenny. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say they are really, I love paintings on copper because they have this luminescence to them. And they are almost enamel-like in appearance. I think it's really fascinating thinking about, this piece in particular and her working method. And I think it's important to point out too that this was a method, you know, that artists use, right? It, you know, she wasn't like creating her own practice here of making a drawing and then transferring it. I think sometimes I found in the past when I'm speaking to people about historical women artists and kind of, you know, the techniques that they're used, if they're not familiar with artistic practice of a particular time period in general, then they might think, oh, well, this is what a woman did. But no, this is just what artists across the board did, and one method of kind of transferring an image from one place to another. Yeah. Does she have other works on copper?
She does. We have a number of them in the exhibition. So most famously, she painted a self-portrait on copper, a very small circular copper panel, what we call a tondo, and it comes from the Galleria degli Uffizi. And that was painted in 1579 when the artist was around 27 years old. So, you know, she only began to paint in her early 20s, and her earliest datable pictures are from around 1575. So she was working on copper really from the outset of her career.
Wow. Yeah, that's
Can I ask, can I jump in? I know that you talked a little bit about the acquisition of this particular work. It was sort of a recent addition to the Getty Museum's collection in LA. Can we go back a slide actually, Ginny, because we did have a question in the Q&A, wondering a little bit about how the National Gallery of Ireland acquired this particular work. And I wonder if you could provide some insight into that.
I'd be delighted to, because it's a great story. So the National Gallery of Ireland opened its doors in 1864, and Ireland, you know, opened its National Gallery without any sort of grand bequest upon which to base our collection, or any sort of royal collection in Ireland. So basically our very early founders went shopping, and they made some really incredible acquisitions in the early years of the gallery's foundation, not least of which was this. So this was purchased just 6 years after we opened in 1872, and it was purchased from Christie's in London. But its life before that is very, very interesting in that it had come to London from the Palais Royal in Paris. So sometime in the 1850s, Prince Napoleon, who was the cousin of Napoleon Bonaparte, went to Italy and purchased this painting via an intermediary from the palazzo in Bologna in which it was held. And he brings it to Paris, and it joins the rest of his collection in the Palais Royal. And the Palais Royal is set alight dramatically by revolutionaries during the Paris Commune in 1871. So this painting, at a colossal, almost 3.5 meters wide, is one of just a handful that is rescued from this burning palazzo and transported from there to London. And I can tell you, this usually lives upstairs in the National Gallery of Ireland in our upper galleries, while our exhibition space is downstairs. And we brought around 66 objects together for the exhibition from most corners of the globe. And the biggest logistical challenge was to bring our own Lavinia Fontana from the upper galleries to the lower. So I cannot imagine how they rescued it from a burning building, but they did. And thankfully, it's here now for us to enjoy and for posterity.
That's an incredible story. Is there any indication that they might have taken it off of the stretcher and rolled it at any point?
That's a really interesting question. It doesn't appear in this instance during that very moment to have been removed from its stretcher. It seems to have been transported out of the palace and transported to London on its stretcher. And what we do see is a little bit of what appears to be fire damage around the edges of the painting. And thankfully, not in any of the sort of most important focal points of the composition, they remained completely undamaged. But there is clear evidence of that early fire and that early trauma that our poor composition underwent.
Yes. I mean, it's amazing, honestly, that anything survived.
I know.
Of history, but especially something of this size. And I mean, I think it just, you know, it speaks to the importance that people placed on it, even in the 19th century.
Well, this is exactly it. And often people wonder what people might have thought of an artist like Lavinia Fontana in the 19th century, when, you know, tastes were very different to what they are now, and sensibilities were very different, of course, as well. But it seems that this work was so impressive in its scale, in its level of detail, that whoever was the person doing the evacuation recognized its material value even at that point in history.
And it was always it was always attributed, it's always been known to be by Lavinia Fontana. It hasn't been attributed.
It's never been recorded under another name, although it's not recorded at all. It doesn't appear in any documentation from Lavinia's own lifetime. It begins to appear in inventories in Bolognese noble collections in the 17th century, in the mid 17th century, from around 1635 onwards. And then it's finally given the name Lavinia Fontana by an archaeologist named Luigi Lanzi, writing at the end of the 19th century. And since then, it's carried that attribution, which has rarely, or if ever, come into question by people who have seen it, because it's very much quintessentially her, I think.
Yeah, so it was sold in the 19th century at Christie's as Lavinia Fontana.
Correct. And so the National Gallery of Ireland were purchasing works by women artists as early as that. In fact, the first work by a woman artist we purchased came before we even opened our doors, and that was our portrait of Duke Alessandro Farnese by Sofonisba Anguissola. So we're lucky to have these important pieces in our founding collection.
Absolutely.
Yes, it's fascinating because I think that, you know, we have this idea that, you know, women artists, even though during their lifetimes they may have been very well known and respected and successful, that, you know, after they die, their names are forgotten. And, you know, it's really only in the past 40 years that their names have been resurrected. But obviously the story is a lot more complicated than that. And I think particularly in the 19th century, we have a lot of indications that many early modern women artists, you know, if you look at sales data, that they, you know, they remained popular and known. And so, yeah, it's an interesting story for sure.
No, it's definitely not as cut and dry as, you know, we are only rediscovering them now. They have held celebrity status for many centuries, but like you say, that history is complicated and it's ebbs and flows over time as tastes have changed.
Exactly. Yeah.
We have another question actually in our Q&A, and I think since we're on this image, maybe we can talk a little bit about it. Karen is asking, what is the inscription on the bottom left? It looks like it's maybe on one of the steps. Do we know what that says?
Yeah. It is. It's on a step in the foreground and in Latin, and I'm not going to even attempt to read it in Latin if you'll forgive me, but the translation loosely reads as, the Queen of Sheba visited King Solomon and asked him a great many questions. And then it gives the biblical verse from which this passage is drawn. So it's pointing us to the Old Testament and telling us what we're looking at here is these two biblical royals, the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. King Solomon, of course, being this Old Testament figure who was attributed with God-given wisdom. And the passage tells us that the Queen of Sheba visits King Solomon to test this wisdom and asks him all kinds of questions. And when she is satisfied that he is as wise as his reputation has led her to believe, she gives him a great many gifts. And so that's the cavalcade behind her, carrying all sorts of things. But what's interesting about the picture is that we're clearly not looking at a biblical scene here. We're looking at a 16th century court. So this is, in fact, an allegorical portrait rather than a biblical painting.
No, thank you so much for touching on that. And just to clarify, I know that some folks were curious. You mentioned earlier that she didn't really have assistants. Is that correct? Are we correct in understanding that? But that I did want to bring up that her husband was a painter as well, and that he probably assisted her in some level. Is that accurate to say?
It's the subject of debate. So this is a very interesting topic, really, and a very interesting question. So Fontana is the first woman known to have run her own workshop. What that workshop looked like is very difficult for us to establish, because, you know, contemporary early modern writers were focused so much on the uniqueness of there being a woman artist practicing professionally in the Renaissance world that they focus almost entirely on her gender and say very, very little about her workshop practice or the space in which she might have operated. Now, we know that she inherited the large family workshop from Prospero Fontana, and in the 1580s and 1588, she moves the entire workshop across the city and more or less creates a new one that's all her own. And there's no evidence to suggest that she had workshop assistants. I think with very large scale compositions, she must have had help, and it would have been conventional for artists of this period, if they didn't have permanent assistants working in their workshop, to contract specific artists to work on specific aspects of a composition. We also know that workshops Bolognese workshops in this period were often made up of a series of adjoining rooms that were in the upper stories of these great arcaded streets for which Bologna is famous. So it's very possible that Fontana had other artists working in spaces separate to her own. Of course, it would have been considered not so virtuous for her to work alongside other male artists, and there were no women trained to the sufficient level of proficiency at this time in order to be her assistants full time. As to the question of whether her husband helped her, it's a really interesting one. There are some biographers from the 17th century that describe him as a painter and suggest that he also trained in the Fontana family workshop. But the one writer that did know the couple personally, Giulio Mancini, who's writing at the very outset of the 17th century in Rome, at which point Fontana and her family had relocated to the Eternal City. And Mancini writes about Gianpaolo Zappi, Lavinia's husband, in saying that he was more of a painter with words than the brush. So to suggest that if he was a painter, that he wasn't one of any note, and that really what he did within the context of Fontana's studio was manage business affairs and negotiations.
Yeah, thank you.
And maybe also wrangling, 10 children, 11 children?
11 children is right. I mean, he had his hands full, and as you guys know, they had come to an extraordinary arrangement that's detailed in a 16th century manuscript, a marriage contract that I'm very happy to say we have here in Dublin in the exhibition. Their marriage contract stipulated that Gianpaolo would move from his hometown of Imola, move in with Lavinia and her family, essentially take a back seat to her in her professional career and support her as she continued to progress as an artist, and support her as in becoming the breadwinner of the family. And yes, they had 11 children together. Very sadly, only 3 of these children outlived Lavinia. So she had a very difficult life, but she seems to have been supported well by her husband. Another really nice manuscript we have in the exhibition is their baptismal records that he lovingly kept over the years between 1578 and 1595, when all 11 of their babies were born. He writes down their names, the date of birth, the time, where they were christened, who their godparents were, and then really poignantly he annotates it over the years and records their deaths as well. So he seems to have been an involved and loving parent and a supportive husband to his wife.
It's really interesting. And a great record keeper as well. Good to have that information. Well, I love looking at this work. I'd like for us to sort of pop ahead and check out a work from our collection that is in the exhibition as well. So I particularly love this work, Portrait of Costanza Alidosi. It's a work that we regularly share with visitors when the museum is open, and she's quite a force, quite a figure. She's quite large, and I know visitors of all ages are really curious about this work for a lot of reasons. Some things you mentioned earlier, there are elements of it that are a particular portrait of a specific individual. So they're curious about who this woman is. There's a sense of power in her stance, almost like ready to stand up, of activity. All of the children who see this love the dog. That is a big point of conversation. And then we see these elements of still life again, of interior scene in the background of landscape. I'm really curious though, for you, why was it really important for this piece to be in the exhibition?
I think this is one of the finest examples of the female portraits that Lavinia really became famous for. So we know that even in the 16th century, this is what Lavinia was best known for. Her prime biographer, Carlo Cesare Malvasia, who's writing in the 17th century, describes flocks of women who are running to Lavinia in the streets, all wanting to have their portrait painted by her. And this painting is the sort of perfect illustration of just why that was, in my opinion, in that it shows this woman not as a kind of a passive object for the viewer to enjoy, but rather this independent and strong woman who's returning our gaze and depicted with a degree of naturalism and individualism that we don't see in portraits painted by men earlier, that come before Lavinia herself. And then of course there's the fashion. And I mean, this is something that Lavinia really understood. She understood what fashion could really say about its wearer and why it was so important that these noble women were portrayed in, full flourish, so to speak. So she's painted this incredible velvet gown with such attention to detail that you feel like you could reach out and touch it, although I would never ever encourage a museum visitor to do so. But we have these incredible padded sleeves that are embroidered with this wonderful textured three-dimensional threads. And then you have this, like I said, this luscious velvet gown that you have a wonderful gold cintola or belt that's kind of spilling down the side of it. And you can see actually the way that the gown even folds around her stomach. And it's very naturalistic to show exactly as it is, as anybody sits down, but it's not something that's often depicted in painting. So you can get a sense that you're really looking at a real person. And of course, we know that this is Costanza Alidosi, who is one of the leading beauties in Bologna in this period, and one of the wives of the senators that ruled the city at the time. So Bologna was ruled by 40 families, the 40 senatorial families of the city, and Costanza was one of the prominent noblewomen married to one of these men. And one of the other really unique things about the city in this period is that in the absence of these men, when they traveled, as they often did in diplomatic duties and other things, they were allowed to essentially manage business independently of the men in their lives. So we know that it's very possible that Costanza commissioned this painting herself from Lavinia as a statement of her own personal independence during a period in which she was living alone in her wonderful palazzo in the city centre.
It's really interesting. Yeah, it's wonderful always to see works of ours that we're so sort of familiar with and used to seeing and just hearing other perspectives. The next slide, actually, I wonder if we can talk a little bit about, there was some imaging done on this work, and it gave you some insight into Lavinia Fontana's practice. Is that true? Let's see if we can see that.
It is.
Yeah. Oh, there
we got it.
Yeah.
So here we are back at the dogs as well, which is something everyone wants to know, and everyone's been really, really pleased to meet Costanza's little puppy as they've come into the exhibition. And these dogs appear very regularly. We see them in many of Fontana's portraits. They're often referred to generically as cane Bolognese, which just means Bolognese dog. But in reality, they're sort of the ancient ancestor of the King Charles Cavalier Spaniel. And these little guys were the ultimate accessory for every noblewoman who was anybody in Bologna in the 16th century. And we know that they were extraordinarily expensive to purchase, and that the smaller they were, the more expensive they became. And so they really are the ancient sort of counterpart of the teacup chihuahua that many celebrities of today carry in handbags. This is exactly the same concept that we see here. But what's been interesting technically about studying your wonderful portrait, as well as some others that we've managed to get technical imaging of, is that we see how Fontana is working, how she's laying out these portraits as she creates them. And what we notice is that while she's painting these incredibly ornate fabrics, these beautiful, beautiful gowns with heavy embroidery, she tends to leave a little space for the dogs, specifically for the dogs. And we always see this little sort of silhouette, and you can see it on the right-hand side here, where she will only apply as much decoration as she needs to on the textile, because of course this is incredibly time-consuming as a practice, and she'll leave that little space in reserve to insert her little canine companion later on.
That's great.
That's thinking ahead. That's very practical.
She was definitely making good use of her time. And again, this is, I suppose, feeds into the idea that she didn't, while she may have had some studio assistants, she didn't have a large team working beside her. And so she had to make sure that she wasn't wasting any moments.
I just want to go back if I can to the whole thing. Oh, no, well, we got this one. Let's talk about this one.
Why not? Why not? This is a quite a well-known painting by Lavinia Fontana depicting Judith with the head of Holofernes. And I think this is one that many people who have read or thought about Fontana will have encountered. It was on the cover of Caroline Murphy's great monograph, which was published in the early 2000s. But it won't be known to many people as the image on the left. Rather, it's been known to people for a long, long time as the image that you see on the right. So one of the really wonderful things that we can do with these kinds of exhibitions, our exhibition has generously been sponsored by Bank of America and some other corporate partners. And this has allowed us to finance the conservation of works before they've traveled to the exhibition. And this is one of my favorite parts of curating a show of this scale, because you can impart a real lasting gift to paintings where, you know, they come from institutions that are often smaller and may not have the resources to do this kind of work themselves. But I never anticipated the kind of extraordinary transformation that we experienced with this painting. So it was known to us, as I said, as the image on the right. And when the conservators in Bologna, this comes from the Museo Davide Bargellini in Bologna, which is a small but very rich collection in Bologna. And when they began to clean it, a team of conservators for the lab in Ottorino Non Formale lab in Bologna began to clean it. They discovered that the background had been completely overpainted with this blackish brown paint that obscured so much of the detail and the color. And paired with a very thick yellow varnish, the vibrancy of the work had been completely lost. So you could have knocked me over with a feather when I received the after image right before our catalogue went to print, thankfully. So we've got her on the cover of our catalogue because she's just such a dramatic transformation. And she's also believed to be a self-portrait of the artist, which is a really interesting aspect of this composition. This is a sort of a moment in which Lavinia has overcome adversity, a lot of adversity, by 1600, and she's presenting herself here victorious as the great Old Testament heroine, the first feminist icon, perhaps.
Yeah, that blue in the background is incredible.
It really is, and there's a little landscape down on the left-hand side as well.
I was wondering about that.
And then signatures as well. So there was a later signature on the painting that had been visible, for a long time, but we found the original one beneath that murky brown paint. So it was a really, really rewarding project, and something, again, I'm really, really pleased that the gallery could sponsor.
It also really reveals sort of the fabric and its sort of translucency, or it's just really beautiful to see these both side by side. You get a real appreciation for sort of the depth of space that you couldn't really tell before it was conserved. So it's really lovely. Actually, we had a question generally about signatures on her work. Did Fontana always sign her work? Can you tell us more about that?
She didn't always sign her work, and Babette Bone has written about this in her recent publication on her 2021 book, I should say, on women painters and their patrons in early modern Bologna. And she records the sort of rate of signatures as around 50% of Fontana's oeuvre is signed. So the other 50% not, which is a difficult thing because it means that, sometimes we can be absolutely certain about attribution, but in many cases we have no signature whereby to verify Fontana's authorship of a painting. Oftentimes we see that she'll sign more of her devotional works and more of her straightforward portraits than her nudes. And I think that there's probably an obvious reason for that, that these things would have been less publicly accessible and maybe things that she didn't want to associate her name so prominently with. But the lack of signatures on many of her works has really led to a need for more technical study, and that's been one of my big aims in this project, is to try and gather as much technical information on Lavinia and her practice as we possibly can to support the attribution of new works, because I feel certain that there must be many, many more Lavinias out there, and we're seeing it on the market every day. There's more works coming up being attributed to her, whether correctly or not. But having this kind of information, this information that tells us what the defining characteristics are of her technique, will aid us in kind of sorting the good from the bad.
Yeah, this is another really important kind of ripple effect too, from an exhibition, a big monographic exhibition like this, and that, more people are on the lookout, if you will, for works by, in this instance, Fontana, and that can widen the oeuvre considerably. And I'm coming across the same issue with Dutch and Flemish women artists, that, we have one or two works that are, attributed or signed, hopefully. But I know that there's got to be more out there because, again, these women were written about, they had careers, there's got to be more around. And so, yeah, I think the more name recognition, the better for everybody in terms of being able to identify more works by these women. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. The more people as well that become sort of familiar with what a Lavinia Fontana painting looks like, the better able we will be to sort out her oeuvre, which is complicated and, as you say, growing. I think in Bone's 2021 publication, she records 130 paintings by Lavinia that we can securely attribute to the artist. But at this point, that's already grown. I mean, I think by the end of the exhibition, I'm hoping it will be up to maybe 140. And there are a few works in our show that will never have been seen before by public eyes. So it's an exciting time, and not just for Lavinia, but as you say, Ginny, for many other women artists of this period, of the early modern period.
Yeah.
We have another cool comment and question, actually. We're coming sort of to a close, unfortunately. I feel like we could talk for hours about this. It's so fascinating. But Chuck in the Q&A was mentioning that he recently went to Rome and went to where she's buried, to where Fontana is buried, to pay homage, but there's no marker. He said that the original marker was damaged and removed. He's wondering,
Yes.
sort of throwing it out there, how do we correct this? Surely the church has records that about her internment there, and it would be great if there was a movement to have a marker reinstalled.
You're absolutely right. And this is the kind of work that I hope when we demonstrate people's interest in this wonderful artist, and maybe we rehabilitate her name to some degree, we can start to make these arguments. You know, it's a sad thing that her tomb is in fact lost. We know that she was buried in Minerva's Santa Maria Sopra Minerva, but we know again that her tomb, the precise location of it within the confines of this church, have been lost. Her epitaph has been recorded for posterity. I think it says something like, "Here lies Lavinia Fontana, a great painter on par with the great men of her age." And again, she's been referred to in the context of men. And we see this with many artists' tombs, you know, women artists in particular. Later on, Bolognese artist Elisabetta Serrani, who was another great woman of this extraordinary city, is buried with Guido Reni, with a male artist from the same period, because the two were compared and she was sort of recognized as Guido reborn. But, you know, that's another sort of injustice that I would love to correct if I were ever given the opportunity. How much influence a lowly curator can have on such matters, I'm not sure, but, you know, it's a nice idea.
But it's great to get the word out about that. I think, you know, the more we're talking about her, the more her story is really sort of fleshed out, and more questions people ask about her and her life. There are a few other questions I want to make sure we get to. One is there anywhere a checklist for the exhibition that folks can access?
We don't tend to publish these things online. It's not sort of a typical practice for museums, but we have published a really extraordinary full color catalogue that features every work that's represented in the exhibition. And Yale University Press will distribute that across the US, so it should be available online, if not now, then very, very soon.
Great, thank you for that. And then Jenny is asking, what would you consider to be sort of the artistic characteristic that leads you to identify a work by Fontana? Is there something in particular? I'm sure it's a whole host of things. But
it's interesting because it's difficult to give sort of very specific characteristics that we can apply across the board to Fontana's work, because like many women artists, she is responding stylistically to the visual landscapes that she encounters as she encounters them. So unlike her male contemporaries or predecessors, she's not exposed to this sort of world of art at an early age. She's not able to visit private collections. She's not able to travel beyond her own city. And so she seems to encounter and respond to different artistic styles as she goes. One of the sort of consistent technical or stylistic characteristics that we can attribute to her, and that seems to recur in every work that she paints, is her incredibly meticulous attention to detail, particularly as it pertains to the representation of fabrics, of textiles, and also of jewelry. And this is something that I think that we can really use when we're trying to make attributions. But there are other things that we've identified, as I've kind of touched upon. We've identified specific pigments that she used in specific moments, and the manner in which she handles pigments and things like flesh tones and in hair, and in the creation of this sort of semi-transparent, wonderful fabric. So there are a few different bits and pieces. But in the catalogue, I've written an essay, in fact, about Lavinia Fontana and her technique and workshop practice to delve into the defining characteristics that we've been able to pin down.
That's really exciting. I can't wait to read the catalog. I can't believe our time is sort of coming to a close, and we so appreciate you being with us today. I think we answered almost all the questions in the Q&A. Jenny, did you want to just kind of round us out?
Thank you so much for this. This has really been spectacular. I don't know if it's in the cards for me to get to Dublin to see this, but I really hope so. I mean, Fontana is just such an extraordinary artist. And to your point about her detail, particularly in fabric, you know, if you are someone who really appreciates that in painting, you know, try to see a Fontana painting in person if you can, whether in Washington or in Dublin, because it's really, really just extraordinary skill that she displays. So thank you so much, and congratulations on amazing and really, really important exhibition.
It's my absolute pleasure, and thank you and to all of your regular visitors for very kindly parting with Costanza Alidosi for a little while. We're really, really pleased to have her here in Dublin during your period of closure, and we hope that some of you will be able to make it over to the exhibition, and if not, then Costanza will return to Washington DC at the end of August to be reintegrated into your newly opened, newly renovated buildings.
Well, she will actually be in Baltimore first.
Oh, forgive me.
She's traveling. She's the world traveler.
she's a busy lady.
She's racking up her points, you know. She's getting her sky miles in.
That's right.
But
She'll be
in the exhibition of Baltimore and the Art Gallery of Ontario on early modern women artists. But we also have a portrait of a noblewoman by Lavinia Fontana in our collection that will be on view when we reopen in October.
And a wonderful portrait it is.
And are there any will the exhibition be traveling after it closes with you all?
Unfortunately, it's a one venue show. It was a victim of the pandemic in that when I got the green light to put this on the calendar, most museums in the world were closed and no one really quite knew what would happen in 2023. And by the time we had a better idea, most museum schedules were more or less packed from 2023 to 2025. So at the moment, there are no plans for it to travel. It's just in Dublin until the 27th of August. But if you would like to visit, we'd be delighted to welcome you. It's a quick hop from the States.
Seems like a good reason to visit Ireland, as if there weren't others. But again, thank you so much for being with us today and for your sort of dedicated work on Fontana. We're so excited about just the opportunity to speak with you. And I want to thank all of our viewers for your great questions today and for tuning in. Our next episode of NMWA xChange isn't until August. It's going to be on the exhibition Holding Ground, Artist Books for the National Museum of Women in the Arts. That will be on August 8th, which is again a Tuesday at 12 noon Eastern. And our guests will be the exhibitions coordinator, Lenora Williams, who's the former director of the museum's library, as well as contributing book artists, Adjoa Burrows and Colette Fu. And you can visit our catalog at NMWA.org to learn more and to register for that program. Again, congratulations, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Addie. Thank you, Ginny. And thank you all for listening today.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.